Hi, I'm Steve Maccabee and welcome to the P-Pod. Just a quick note before we get started. This episode contains safeguarding topics that some listeners might find tricky and it's not suitable for children. Please also be aware that everything we share was accurate at the time of recording, but guidance and services do change, so do make sure you're checking out the latest information. Now, if this episode sparks your thinking, share it with your team, start a conversation, and don't forget to follow the P-Pod so you never miss an episode. Let's get into it.
Welcome to the P-Pod.
Right then, welcome back once again to the P-Pod, the partnership podcast from the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership. Now, anybody who has been on any of our training or been part of any of our events will know that something we are really passionate about is recognising the impact of unconscious bias on safeguarding. It is there, it is within us, whether we like it or not. And it's really important that we can recognise that and raise awareness of it, because it can have quite a profound impact on how we view and approach the safeguarding of children. If we think about a child who is being neglected, we quite often have that immediate visual image of a child who is very grubby or smelly and the house is very cluttered and chaotic. When we think about domestic abuse, we think about men as perpetrators of domestic abuse and women as victims of domestic abuse. When we think about child sexual exploitation, we often think about girls being sexually exploited. When we think about criminal exploitation, we quite often have that instant view that boys are criminally exploited. And whilst we do know that those things do take place, actually it's important that we are aware of a much wider view of some of the risks and vulnerabilities to children and young people. So on that note, I'm really, really pleased today to introduce you to Dr. Alex Bailey, who is forensic psychologist with the amazing Lucy Faithfull Foundation, coming to talk to us about a really important aspect of this, and this is picking up on the topics we've been talking about around child sexual abuse. And whilst often we do think about men as perpetrators of sexual abuse, it's really important that we also recognise that some women can also abuse children. And I know this is a real area of specialism for Alex. So Alex, thank you so much for joining us today. I think I'm really interested, in today's topic to do a bit of a deep dive into this, if that's okay. So yeah, thanks for coming along.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I'm always really pleased to be asked to kind of come forward and talk about the women, because it isn't something that's talked about a lot, and it is something we need to talk about.
Absolutely. Well, I'll tell you what, before we get into that, I'm sure many people know of the Lucy Faithfull Foundation, very well-known national charity, does amazing work. And we've worked with previously on some of our forum weeks and other events. But for anybody who's not heard of the Lucy Faithfull Foundation, could you just give us a quick update on who you are and what you do, and then we'll get into the topic?
Sure. So Lucy Faithfull Foundation, we are a child protection charity. We are the only child protection charity kind of nationally that deals specifically and solely with the prevention of child sexual abuse. So our view is that child sexual abuse is preventable, not inevitable. We obviously work in a tertiary prevention space, but we do a lot of work within a secondary prevention space as well. And one of those particular projects is our Stop It Now helpline. So our Stop It Now helpline is our national helpline for anybody who has any concerns about child sexual abuse. So that's including people who are concerned about themselves. So they might be concerned about their thoughts or behaviour towards children, or it might be other adults that are concerned about another adult in their life, a loved one in their life and their behaviour towards children, as well as talking to parents of children that may have engaged in harmful sexual behaviour, or parents who are concerned that their child might be being abused or groomed or exploited in some way. We also support professionals on the helpline as well. So we get lots of calls from professionals who might have cases that they're dealing with, that there's something there that might feel a bit complex or something that they're not sure about, that they can come to us to get advice to via the Stop It Now helpline. Aside from the helpline, we also have other services as well. So one of the things that we do is we offer risk assessment and intervention services. Usually, particularly our referrals come through the local authority and come through children's services. So if there's a case that somebody's working on, and they would like to get a specialist risk assessment done or have some intervention put in place, then they can refer to us through that. And quite a lot of my work is done through that service, and particularly doing sort of risk assessments with women where they've either committed offences or there are concerns about the woman's behaviour in terms of her sexual behaviour towards children.
No, brilliant. Thank you. And if it's okay, we'll come back and just pick up around the Stop It Now campaign as well, because it's a brilliant campaign. We have had some of your colleagues on our recent forum week talking about Stop It Now, and it's such an important campaign, I think. So yeah, it'd be good if you can come back and highlight that at the
Sure.
end and kind of help people find out more about it. Thank you. Well, I'm kind of picking up from that first point then, obviously the introduction. We talked about this obviously on the subject of child sexual abuse. And as I mentioned as part of the intro, quite often when people think about child sexual abuse, they often picture a male perpetrator. And just to be clear, we absolutely know that men do perpetrate sexual abuse. So we're not saying that they don't as part of today's episode. But I think in terms of thinking about women in this context, what is it that we miss when we kind of picture men as sole perpetrators of sexual abuse and don't talk about women in this context? What do we miss and why is it important to talk about this?
I think we need to kind of first take a real look at how we as society view men and women. So in sort of socialization or stereotypes and things like that, we do view men and women as different. And we tend to view men as being potentially more aggressive, more authoritative than women, whereas women we tend to view as almost kind of being the carers, the nurturers, definitely people who are maybe more passive and submissive in sexual encounters. We also often see women as being the people who will do things for others at their kind of own expense, really. We see maybe men as more acting upon their needs and women more putting the needs of others before themselves. And that's generally how in society we tend to view people. That tends to be the messages that come out in lots of different places. So if we think about the way sort of sexual behavior with women is maybe portrayed in the media and things like that, certainly portrayed as being maybe more submissive, or even in sometimes a humorous way. We've all seen the TV program or the film where the woman gets pulled over for a speeding ticket and kind of flirts her way out of it, and it's all seen as being kind of light-hearted. And because of that, because of those societal views, actually what we end up doing is denying that women can actually cause sexual harm, that they can actually have motivations to sexually abuse, that they can be sexually aggressive in any way, shape or form. And so with that denial then comes huge difficulties when it comes to child protection and child safeguarding. Because when we come into a situation where we believe there's concerns, we're automatically looking at the man. We're not necessarily thinking about the woman. But also if we think about victims, if you've got a society that finds it really hard to acknowledge that women can cause sexual harm, and you've been sexually harmed by a woman, that's incredibly hard for then you to come forward and speak out about that. And then, of course, sexual abuse, we know how incredibly damaging that is anyway. But then also if you're in a situation where you feel like nobody's going to believe you if you come forward, nobody's going to acknowledge that this was even possible, then we've got victims here that will never be able to speak out and get the support they need, or even further safeguarding of other children moving forwards.
I think that's a really important point, because sadly we know that in terms of prosecutions of sexual abuse, when there is a male perpetrator, is hard enough as it is in the first place. But adding, like say, that extra layer on there of a female perpetrator, I think that's a really important point to think about, and not just from a professional's point of view about taking action and recognizing that in the first place, but like say from the victim's point of view, thinking nobody's ever going to believe this has happened to me in this context there. I think picking up on what you're talking about there, I think when we look at it from the lens of safeguarding, there was some really interesting research, and I'm going to be really bad now. I'm going to quote research, and I can't remember who did it or when it was, but there was some research that looked at child protection plans, and particularly was looking at gender. And I think what was really interesting of that is looking at the actions from child protection plans. They looked at the kind of risks that were there for the child. And I think what it pulled out very clearly from that is when we were looking at female caregivers, the concerns that were there were very much viewed as vulnerabilities that required support. So drug and alcohol needs or mental health needs, and very much looking at how agencies could support that. And when they looked at exactly the same needs for men or male carers, they were very much framed in terms of risk that needed to be avoided and sort of safeguarding against and kept away from. So I think it is interesting how we can see things quite black and white sometimes, even if we're not aware of it. And having that bias can massively steer what we do, both as professionals and, like I say, for victims themselves, of how they feel safer with professionals around them that should be there to care for them. But actually within that sphere that we're in, it's incredibly difficult, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think you've hit on something there, is that quite often when we look at a family unit, we consider the woman within that family unit to be the person of safety. And the women are often looked at as being the protective carers. And don't get me wrong, a lot of the time that's exactly the case. But there are some situations when actually the woman can also be harmful and can be creating those harms, whether or not she is directly involved in the abuse, for example, or whether she is almost what one typology sort of termed as the passive mother, which is a woman who may not be directly involved, but knows that it's happening, may well be facilitating it in some way or observing the abuse. So even though she is not doing the physical abuse, actually her behavior and the way that she is acting means that abuse is possible and facilitated for whoever it is that is perpetrating that direct physical abuse.
Yeah. So what I'm picking up on then that. So what does research tell us about how common this is and how it might be underreported or misunderstood? And obviously within your role, it's kind of quite strongly focused around that. So
Yes.
what does the research tell us?
So, as you say, I mean, one of the really tricky things about this is the underreporting issue. So, if you look at kind of official statistics, so if we look at things like police recorded crime or convictions or even the number of women getting custodial sentences, I mean, we know generally when it comes to offending behaviour, the numbers between men and women in terms of those in custody is such a huge difference. I think women make up about 4% of the prison population. That percentage then shrinks when you're looking at sexual offences against children. So it tends to be around 2% that comes out within the official statistics. So 2% of sexual offences attributed to the person perpetrating being a woman. So that's what the official statistics are telling us. However, if you then look at victim studies, so studies where victims have been asked who was the perpetrator of the abuse against you, that number is often about 5 times higher. So we are getting a real picture and a real trend here of what victims are saying to us is that this is more prevalent than the official statistics are telling us. Now, that's not a shock to us because we know that child sexual abuse is an underreported crime anyway. So we know the rates are higher than the official statistics are telling us. But actually, it feels like that gulf might be a bit bigger for the women. And that comes back to exactly some of the things that we've talked about already, which is how women are viewed. You know, the fact that women's abusive behaviour in that way can be denied or it can be reframed. You know, it can be reframed in terms of lacking of intent. Or the other thing that's really important to consider is because women can often be the caregivers of children, abuse can take place within behaviours that would be seen as being a normal part of mothering, but actually they've been sexualised. So that can be things like breastfeeding, like changing, bathing, you know, all that kind of personal and intimate care, which then can make that abuse very hard to spot.
It is fascinating. Like you say, when official statistics are often very, very different to reality on the ground, isn't it? So you talked about some of the things you might see. So in terms of sort of talking through some of these contexts you most commonly see, what is it that you see in your research or your daily sort of work? And, you know, do you see it mainly in family settings, in caregiving roles, child-on-child abuse? just so we can kind of really understand that variety of what we're looking at here.
Yeah, and I mean, to be honest, it's all of the above. So, and that's the tricky thing, isn't it? You know, we know that people who commit these types of offences are a very diverse group, and it can happen in lots of different contexts. But in terms of the research, in terms of my clinical experience, we can see sort of some clusters in terms of typologies, if you will. And firstly, what you might have is the women who are offending against adolescents. So these are often women in a position of power. So they could be teachers, they could be coaches, you know, they could be mentors, support workers. And the offense is usually the kind of first contact with the victim is not necessarily kind of premeditated, but there kind of becomes a lot of planning after that. And they are also the kind of group of women where sexual motivation tends to be more overt, I suppose. There's a sexual attraction to the victim who is usually an adolescent or a teenager. Whereas actually that's less prominent with some of the other groups that we might talk about.
Sorry, Alex, can I just jump in there for a second?
Yeah.
I've got to be honest with you. One of the things that absolutely makes my blood boil every single time you see it, and you see it time and time again, is in terms of media reporting. And obviously, you know, as part of my role developing the training side of things, we're often looking at case study examples in relation to people who have abused children within settings when we're looking at allegations management, what have you. And time and time again, when you see it often in cases like you've just been explaining, where you may have a teacher who's been abusing a child, an adolescent, so many times it is reported as things like they had been having a relationship for 2 years or 3 years before this came out. And I think particularly when in that adolescent kind of framing, it is so common for it to be framed in that way.
Mhm.
I find when we're looking at young children, young babies, often it is framed very differently. But with those adolescents, it's often they were in a relationship for 2 years before they turned 16 or something like that. Whereas if, you know, with a male perpetrator, it's immediately framed as what it should be framed as abuse, as child. But it's so common that you see that and that reporting. They've been in a relationship and it only came to light when they went on holiday when they turned 16 or something like this. And it's like, no, we've got to stop framing things in this way. It's wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes exactly back to what we were saying. If that's how things are being framed, then how easy would that be for that young person to then come forward and say, this is what's been happening to me?
Sure.
And there is this narrative, particularly if we're talking about adolescent boys, that this is something that actually they should be kind of grateful for.
Mm.
You know, isn't he lucky? You
Yeah.
know, in terms of you know, being able to be in a relationship with this older woman. And if we think about like coming back to the way we do socialization in regard to men and women, boys, male socialization in that way, it's like making them grow up too quickly. It's putting these ability to make adult decisions onto children. And the problem is, this also is a factor with the women who are engaging in this kind of abuse because they don't necessarily see it in the way that it's wrong. They often see it in, you know, this is mutual, this is consenting, you know, we're intimate, we love each other. And of course, if a man was saying that, what we would be terming that as being would be cognitive distortions, would be minimization, which is exactly what that is. But then if we've got the women thinking that, and then we've got an external message from kind of media and things like that giving that as well, that's a really unhelpful place to be, isn't it?
Absolutely. Sorry to interrupt you.
No.
It's one of these triggering things for me. You see it so many times, and also, and there was one I was reading was about 6 or 12 months ago, and I think there'd been a teacher who'd been abusing, I think it was 3 boys, and it was very much framed in that way. But also, I think the end result of it was, well, she got a suspended sentence for it or something like that. And you think, God, again, you know, if that was a male perpetrator, it would have been taken very, very, very differently, I suspect. But yeah, sorry, I interrupted you about that. So we're talking about that sort of those typologies, like you say. So that's one of them then. What else do you see?
So I just want to pull up on that point that you just said, actually, because one of the things that we can find is that the way the women are framed is almost in this mad, bad or sad kind of
Right.
scenario. So they were either, she was mentally unwell, she didn't know what she was doing, or she's pure evil, she's bad, she's just completely away from what a woman should be and things like that, or she's sad in the somebody else forced her to do it. She didn't have control over her own lives, and that seems like a comfortable place for people to frame
Using
like
a
the
man
women.
married for years and
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So some of those other groups, I suppose, kind of coming back on that sad that we just mentioned, is that there is obviously a group of women who will offend with a co-offender,
right, yeah,
and usually that's a man who's a co-offender. Now, the interesting thing is that not all of those situations are the same. So there's one that actually I think feels much more comfortable when we're thinking about women who sexually abuse. And that is the woman who sexually abuses in a domestic abuse relationship with a man.
mm,
So therefore, the motivation of the abuse is very much related to fear.
right.
If I don't do this, what will the consequences kind of be? And in some ways, I feel like that sits more comfortably with people.
Yeah, and it's something you see quite often, and you see it with I don't know, very high profile murders and things like that, isn't it? Where there's think about people like Myra Hindley or the Moors murders and Fred and Rose West, and I don't know the full details of that. I wasn't there, but it is like that. It often feels more comfortable to frame it as they were both involved, but really he was the perpetrator and she was kind of going along with it. And like I say, it feels more comfortable, I think, as a society to frame it in that way.
Yeah, definitely. But then you have also got women who offend with a co-offender who are what we might term as being accompanied. So that first group we talked about, we might talk about coerced women. But then there's another group that we might talk about being accompanied. And these are women who are actually engaging in the abuse more freely and more directly. So there isn't that coercion, that fear in regard to the relationship they have, but more that they're engaging in that offending behavior, perhaps to remain in the relationship, to please the other person. One of the things that I see quite often now, and I mean, everything changed with the internet and, offending changed and things like that. I work with a lot of women who may have taken child sexual abuse material of their own children and shared it with people online where they're in an online, or they believe they're in an online relationship with this other person. So it's this means of trying to please and keep someone there in that relationship, keep that connection going, which for me is not a coercion. It is the woman having needs of her own in terms of wanting to retain that relationship with that person. And therefore, their offending is part of trying to meet their own needs, like putting their needs in front of the child's.
That's got a real echo for me. I'm sure you're aware of the case of Vanessa George at Little Ted's nursery down in Plymouth. It had real echoes for me of that case, where again I don't know the sort of full details of it. But again, if anybody's not aware, Vanessa George horrifically sexually abusing children, whilst undertaking intimate care for them, and like I say, taking those images, those videos, post them online as part of that forum space and sharing those, and really a really horrific case, isn't it? And I think
Absolutely. And it wasn't just Vanessa George either. There were other women that were involved, and then that central kind of man that I think that all these women kind of felt like they were having a relationship with in some way, that there was some connection with in that sense, where he was, but he was wanting to sort of get the images of the children. So I see that kind of quite frequently in the work that I do, in the women that I work with. So in some ways, these women who are offending with a man, I suppose either way, it sometimes feels more comfortable for people, because they can feel like, well, actually, it's the man directing this. Now, that may be the case a lot of times, not all the time, but that may be the case. But also, we have to look at how freely and how willingly is the woman partaking in the offending behaviour. In some ways, there might be a lot of coercion, a lot of abuse, a lot of fear, but in other ways, they are more freely and willingly engaging in that because it's meeting needs for them. We also then might have women who are offending on their own, but with younger children, usually with prepubescent children. So it might be children in and out of the home, but often what I tend to find is it's more likely to be children in the home, and it's not uncommon that it's their own children as well. And with these women, what we tend to find is, it's very difficult, isn't it, to think about typologies because people don't belong in boxes. People are more complicated than that. But we can look at kind of common themes. And for the women who are offending on their own against the younger children, there are more common themes around mental health issues, mental disorder issues, learning disability, more significant abusive backgrounds where they've been the victim of abuse. They also may be more likely to use aggression within the offending behaviour. So these are women that tend to be a bit more kind of chaotic, and there's a lot more kind of comorbid symptomatology that's going on. There's a lot of issues that we need to kind of think about and deal with, a lot of vulnerabilities and a lot of risks for these women in those circumstances where they're abusing those kind of younger prepubescent children.
People don't fit into boxes, but there are these sort of themes that come up which we can
Really.
start picking up on that. And just picking up around online behaviour. And obviously we know broadly in terms of safeguarding, it's a rapidly increasing area of concern. Are you seeing that more as the Lucy Faithful Foundation and from your role? And how does that kind of online behaviour fit in with what we've just been talking about in terms of that sharing, that facilitation? Is there anything professionals should be aware of, look out for at all?
So again, this is kind of quite a difference between the men and the women, which is really interesting to think about, because when we talk about online offending, one of the things we also think about is the consumption of child sexual abuse material. Women don't tend to be the consumers of child sexual abuse material online. Men do. So it's very rare that women come into the criminal justice system or even to our service where their offence is related to going online and searching for child sexual abuse material. Where the women tend to come up for online is exactly the kind of things that I've been talking to you about. So one is about those relationship forming online, and then the taking and sharing of images as part of, what they might think is a connected relationship with somebody. Online grooming also comes up. So I've worked with a number of women where their adolescent victims that they met online, usually maybe on online gaming or something like that. But again, that kind of fits very well with what we were talking about earlier in terms of the woman who offends against the adolescent offline, is this sort of, it's not thoughts about it not really being wrong, it being consensual, it being mutual, which is interesting because I have worked with women who have also been quite manipulative in that. So maybe told the young person things about themselves that isn't true in order for the young person to then feel quite empathic towards her and feel then bad about severing any kind of online relationship that they've developed. So online, there's definitely this connection element that seems to be there for the women. Generally, to be honest, connection and relationships can often be a huge part of the women's offending. But the other area that we see offending with women in regard to children is live streaming. And particularly when we think about other countries, less more economically deprived countries, particularly we think about Thailand, the Philippines, that sort of thing. I've worked with lots of men where their arrest has come as a result of online streaming with women and children, and then paying for that kind of service. So we're seeing that kind of coming through. The other thing that's important to think about is girls. And in a technological age and sexting and taking images of themselves, of sharing images of themselves. But not only that, maybe receiving, sexting images from a boyfriend that then no longer is a boyfriend. And then they send it on to their friends as kind of revenge or anger or whatever that may be. What we're finding is teenage girls are making up a large portion of these kind of almost like sexting based offences.
Can I just clarify? So with that, is it more in terms of the girls sending the images, or is it more about maybe they've had images shared with them that they're then, and we talk about revenge porn, as such. Does it kind of fit into more of that?
It's both.
Okay.
It's both that are coming up because so they're producing images and sending images and receiving images and sending images. But of course, in the age that we're in, and one of my ex-colleagues used to refer to people as digital natives. That's what we've kind of got now, isn't it? Where this kind of behavior is very normalized amongst teenagers. There is a lot of sexting going on. There's a lot of using the internet and using devices to send sexualized pictures of each other. But what we do find is actually young people really don't recognize the laws around this, the illegality of it, and the risks of it. And so it is coming up as being quite an issue that's needing to be dealt with. And girls are a significant proportion of the young people that this is relevant for. So it's not just something that's sitting with boys, sitting with girls too.
Just in terms of comparisons, when we've talked a bit there about backgrounds and motivations, do you see much of a difference between motivations and backgrounds of men who perpetrators of sexual abuse and women as perpetrators of sexual abuse, or is it kind of similar?
So there are some similarities and there are some differences. So one of the things that's really common in the backgrounds of the women who commit sexual offences is trauma and abuse. So a lot of ACEs that are going on, but also in adulthood, abusive relationships and things like that. So we know that those things are also present for some of the men, but what we tend to find with the women is their victimization experiences and abuse experiences tend to be longer standing and they tend to be more severe than with the men. So multiple abuses that are happening to them in childhood or multiple abusive adult relationships and things like that. So that's something that's very common. There's quite a lot of mental health difficulties coming up, particularly things like depression and anxiety, often before the offences take place and during when the offences are taking place. So mental health is quite a common theme around it. Another kind of common theme can often be almost like a lack of independence. So that might be financial independence or like reduced employment opportunities and things like that. There are a lot of the women that I work with who are maybe reliant on partners financially, or they're reliant on benefits in some way, or they've not had opportunities to do a lot of occupational or employment training. So they've not had a good kind of educational background. And these things I know are not uncommon with the men as well. But we find them a fair bit with women. In terms of motivation and things like that, again, there can be some similarity. So one of the ones we've talked about is around sexual interest and sexual gratification. So we tend to say that that's quite a prominent motivation for men. Actually, it comes through less with the women. When you're talking about the women who are offending against adolescents, that's often when it's more overt. And it doesn't mean that it's not with the other women, but it's less so with them. That's not often what they're saying their primary motivation is. A lot of their motivations can be in relation to relationships. So if we're looking at women with co-offenders, we can see some of those motivations around fear and coercion, but we can also see them around pleasing that partner, connection, intimacy. So intimacy is an interesting one because quite often we talk about men engaging in sexual abuse because they might be wanting intimacy, but there are barriers to them getting that with a peer or somebody their own age. So therefore they go to children because children are maybe less rejecting, easier to control, but easier to gain that kind of intimacy from. Whereas for women, actually, they might be wanting to gain that intimacy, but they want it with the co-offender. It's not that they want the intimacy with the victim. With women who offend against adolescents, we can see that there. But when they're offending against younger children, it can be the fact that they want the intimacy with the co-offender, not the victim, but the abuse is the way in which they think that they're going to get that.
Yeah.
So I've worked with women who have said exactly that the abuse was something that they and the co-offender were doing together, and there was an intimacy within that, and they wanted to have that intimacy with the co-offender. So we've got here a similar motivation, but that's manifesting in a slightly different way. We can also think the same thing about things like power and gaining power.
And power often comes into these things, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
that power imbalance within this.
Yeah. So absolutely that can be a thing for women, and power can be quite a prominent one for women who are offending against adolescents, because quite often what we've seen is that these women are lacking a lot of power in their adult relationships. And actually in this situation is one where they can have power. If they can have that back because of that age difference, that experience difference, all the reasons why abuse with adolescents is considered abuse, but kind of gaining that power in that sort of situation. So we see that a lot there, as well as we can also see it with the younger children as well. I know I've worked with women who have offended against younger children, prepubescent children on their own. And power and control was a huge aspect of that. They could control and have power over these children. And sexual abuse was another way to do that as well. So that's giving them that sense of power and control that they feel like they don't have. So again, the similarities within some of the motivations, but they just may look a little bit different between the men and the women.
Well, what about interventions then around this? And are there many interventions specifically for women? Bearing in mind, like they say, there's perhaps similar motivations, but different manifestations of that. And is there much geared towards interventions for women?
No, it could be a very short answer to that one.
Right.
In terms of specifically, like looking at intervention for women who have committed sexual offences, there is no intervention. There is no accredited intervention the same way that we have with men. And that can be for a number of reasons. One, we don't have as many women. So although we've talked about the fact that actually there are probably more women than we know, I think we're quite confident in saying that the number doesn't meet the number of men that we have. And for that reason, sometimes what that means is we don't get the resources put into developing these things for women, which is sad, but it is understandable. If you've got finite resources and you have to place them towards the population that you think is going to have the maximum impact, when it comes to sexual offences, that's not women as a group, that's men. So often that's what's happened. Obviously, us at Lucy Faithful, I do interventions with women, and I will do them in a bespoke way, depending on what the needs of the woman are or what the risk factors might be we need to address. And one interesting thing that's worth considering with women is there are some women that you will work with, and that certainly I've worked with, that don't need an offence-specific intervention, because the needs that need addressing can be addressed with other interventions. So that might be with trauma work. That might be with work around substance misuse. That might be with work around assertiveness and confidence, work around domestic abuse and healthy relationships. So it is not the case that any woman who has committed a sexual offence will need an offence-specific intervention. So there are resources that we've got all around us and interventions all around us that are relevant for women in this scenario. Some women will need offence-related work, but not all of them. And therefore, we can, and I think it's really important for us not to be in this mindset of just because the woman's committed a sexual offence means that she has to have a sexual offence-specific intervention, and to really look outside the box and think, well, what are the factors that are relevant for this woman? What are the risks that I'm seeing? And how can I meet those risks and needs with the provisions that we've already got.
Like you say, particularly if there is a strong background of ACEs and experiencing a lot of difficulties in their life or their childhood or their adulthood, actually quite often we look to stick plasters. I think there's always a risk with that of, okay, this is the issue that's at the surface, we'll stick a plaster over and that deals with it. But with taking that trauma-informed approach, you've got to have that view of what's underlying all of this.
Yeah, what's really interesting sometimes with the women is we quite often talk about trauma, don't we? We talk about trauma with the men, but it's often not seen as a criminogenic need. It's not seen as a need that directly relates to the offending behaviour. But actually, there's research that's come out with the women that has shown, looking at backgrounds and things like that, and then looking at recidivism, finding that actually abuse experiences are something that can be related to recidivism for women. So it's actually illustrating how important that is for us to tackle those trauma experiences and, as you say, those ACEs or that domestic abuse, because we know that those things can be then directly related. We talk very much about women who have a co-offender and they might be within an abusive relationship. So actually that abusive relationship, that trauma from there, is directly relevant to the offence. It's a need for that woman that we should be focusing on.
Just kind of thinking as well about, we talked at the start of this about how it can be particularly challenging, I think, for children who have experienced abuse to report that to an adult, particularly a female caregiver, as that perpetrator. And from your experience, in terms of that professional response, is there anything that we can do to help create those conditions where a child feels safer to talk to adults or feel more believed, particularly where there's a female perpetrator?
And I think that's really the key, is that idea about being believed. We need to be able to talk about abuse by women in a straightforward but non-collusive way. So we don't downplay things, but we're very straightforward about it. And I think also we need to make sure we're asking the questions, because I think quite often if somebody discloses that they've been abused, we automatically assume they've been abused by a man. And there's a lot of victims that say they were never asked. They never disclosed that they were abused by a woman because they were never asked. So for us to be very clear with that question, were you abused by a man or a woman? That gives a very clear message to the victim, to the survivor, whoever it is that's doing that disclosing, that we know and we acknowledge that this is something that can be done by women. And so I think just trying to strip away the denial, trying to not shy away from this as an issue and being able to be very straightforward about it, I think is really what we need to be putting across as professionals. Because as you say, some of the messages that are coming externally from media, from all that kind of stuff, are not helping that. So we need to be the beacons of that in the way that we present and the way we talk about abuse by women.
I think the more that we can have an openness to these things, and not just this as a topic, but all these topics, the more we can have an openness to that and a genuine openness to that, the more I think it does come across in not just our responses, but our language and everything moves. And I really like that example of, can you tell me, was this perpetrated by a man or a woman? Very simple. I think often people either don't think about that or maybe are afraid of asking that question in case it's leading, but actually it's still a very open question, that. And like I say, it just opens the door to communicate, to say, we are open-minded about this and we want to hear your voice as part of that is really key.
Absolutely.
And I think it's always difficult sometimes to not pigeonhole quite a complex issue.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to give any advice to professionals around indicators or signs to be aware of, or just things actually, if we're looking at, I don't know, maybe somebody receiving supervision and questions that a supervisor might want to ask of somebody just to broaden that horizon, are there any kind of tips you'd give around that?
I mean, I think because a lot of the offending by women is very much relational in a sense, I think that is a really important factor to focus on. Who is in the woman's life? What support does she have, if she has any? Who is she in a relationship with? How well does she know them? Are there any online relationships going on? What are the nature of those? Because actually relationships can form a significant risk for women, whether that be in regard to a co-offender or whether that be in regard to having an unhealthy relationship with somebody else, which may then have an impact on how the woman feels about herself, what kind of way she's looking in order to gain positive feelings, get her needs met, and that sort of thing. So relationships, I think, are a particular important thing to keep an eye on and make sure there's open dialogue about those things, and it's pressed upon how important it is to be open about the relationships and the people in her life, particularly as well if she's still the primary caregiver of the children, which of course we know can absolutely be the case. So we want to focus on those relationship side of things. The other side of it is to be aware of how hidden this kind of abuse can be in terms of those caregiver roles, in terms of the changing, in terms of the dressing. Keep very mindful of boundaries. Keep a good lookout for boundaries within the home. People being dressed and undressed, door knocking, bathroom behaviour, that kind of thing, because of how it can be easy to conceal within the home. Boundaries are a very important thing to be thinking about. I also think when you are working with a family and you know that there's been abuse that's happened, it's also really important to think about and focus on the children to ensure that the children are getting the keep safe work that they need. Because if we're going to break down some of those barriers around talking and disclosure, we've got to really be making sure that the children are aware of what's okay and what's not okay, even if it's done by mum, or even if it's done by auntie, or, whatever that may be, so that those messages are very clearly coming through the household and with the children.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think it's so important. I don't know why, for some reason in my head just a second ago, as you were talking about that, I kind of think about when I was a child, and there was that big sort of stranger danger campaign. And there was that view of terrified me as a child, but people who abuse children, they are older men in raincoats.
Yeah, trench coats, absolutely.
Standing on street corners or parks, and those weirdos over there, and how that just instilled again that bias of that's what somebody who abuses children looks like, acts like, everything else, and we are broadening that now, to understand these things better. That often actually it's not a stranger who abuses, the vast majority of the time. But hopefully, again, we can continue through the work that you're doing and others doing to broaden that out wider. I think is part of that journey to keep on expanding that understanding around these topics.
Absolutely. And coming back to, the issue around victims and survivors and disclosure and that stereotype that you've just mentioned, how much further can that stereotype be when we're talking about your mother, the person who's supposed to love and protect you the most in the world, is then hurting you in a sexual way? And that can result in a lot of confusion for victims around sex and nurturance. Victims growing up actually feeling that sex is the way you show nurturance because those things are smushed together in that kind of scenario. Obviously makes it incredibly hard to speak out, but just couldn't be further from that stereotype that you're talking about, that stranger danger side of things.
Yeah. And we talked about Stopping Now campaign at the start of this episode, which I just wanted to bring us back to because I think it's personally, I think it's such an amazing campaign. And I think it's interesting because sometimes it's been sort of talked about, well, there's a bit of controversy around it, the fact that actually it can be there for perpetrators as well. So for anybody listening to this, either worried about their own thoughts or someone else's behaviours, how can they kind of use Stop It Now?
So, Stop It Now has got a number of different services underneath it. So we've obviously got the Stop It Now helpline, which people can call. So the Stop It Now helpline is open from 9 till 9, Monday to Thursday, and 9 till 5 on a Friday. So we've got pretty long opening hours during the week. So somebody can pick up the phone and call, but that's not the only way. So we've also got a live chat. So people, if they maybe don't feel ready to pick up the phone, they can go online and do a live chat with one of our trained advisors. We also have a secure messaging service, which is basically like a secure email service. So all of these things are anonymous and confidential. Now, the hugely important thing about them being anonymous and confidential is there are a lot of people that would not come forward and seek help about their own thoughts and behaviour if it wasn't anonymous and confidential. And therefore, what they would do would be continue not getting any support. And that's when things escalate and victims are created. And that's what we want to prevent. So giving an opportunity for people who are concerned about themselves to talk to somebody confidentially and anonymously about that, where we can talk to them about how they can manage their behaviour, what they can put in place, offering support and advice with that, we can then protect children and safeguard children. So if somebody contacts one of our Stop It Now services in that way, the first thing we will do is get some information about what the concerns are, what's going on for them, regardless of that situation. If they're concerned about themselves or somebody else, or if it's a parent, we'll want to find out what's going on. And then what we will do is look at that situation and think about, well, what are the best things that can be put in place for protection and prevention here? So what does the environment need? What does the situation need? What do maybe any of the children need? And what does that individual need in order for us to lower the risk and make sure children are protected? And of course, people can continue to ring us and continue to keep in contact with us. So we have people who call us who we almost form part of a prevention plan for them. So that if they might have thoughts or urges to offend, they call us instead and they talk to us, and we can ensure that that's brought down for them and that they leave the call in a much safer position. We also have, which I think is worth mentioning, anonymous online self-help. So via our website, people who are concerned about their own thoughts or behaviour can access self-help modules. So there's a little bit of a divide between people who might be concerned about their behaviour online and those who might be concerned about their thoughts and behaviour offline. But then they can go into these modules, learn information, do exercises to help them think about where has this come from, how is this developed, what are their motivations, like the why side of things. Because, of course, understanding the why is sometimes half the battle. If we can understand why we feel a certain way or why we want to do things we do, then we can have a look at what management can we put in place in order to prevent those things from happening. So people can go through those resources in their own time, anonymously online, as well as they can obviously call us and talk through their work on those modules. So there's many different outlets and options that people can use in order to access those Stop It Now services.
Fantastic. And again, like you mentioned at the start, in terms of Stop It Now, it's not just for those who may harm children. It is for professionals as well, if you're seeking some advice, or loads of information on the website as well. So for anybody listening to this, please check it out. It's fantastic. And the work that Lucy Faithful does is fantastic as well. And I say it's sometimes deemed with Stop It Now, well, there's a bit of controversy because actually it's focused on perpetrators. Actually, I don't think it is focused on the perpetrators myself. I think it's very strongly rooted, focusing on preventing harm to children.
Absolutely.
At the end of the day, that's what we want to do. And actually, if we can put that support in place for perpetrators to stop them doing that, that stops a child from being harmed in the first place. So yeah, I personally think, I don't think there's any controversy around that whatsoever. I think that's a very, very sensible and a very brave approach to take that. And I think for those on phone lines for Lucy Faithful or corresponding with people, that must... talking to somebody who has harmed a child or really talking about wanting to harm a child. And I think there's a lot of skill behind that to be able to work with somebody who's in that space to like you say, help bring them out of that and prevent that from taking place.
We've got a fantastic team, very knowledgeable, very experienced, very good. But exactly as you say, we're working towards this bigger picture, which is the prevention side of things. Absolutely, the services should be there for after abuse has happened, for victims and survivors, and that tertiary prevention side of things. But what we really want to do is stop victims from being created. And in order to do that, in order to solve a problem, you've got to go to the source of the problem. And the source of the problem is the people that are causing harm or want to cause harm. And we do get many people contacting us saying, this is how I feel. I don't want to go down that road. And we want to be able to help them ensure that they don't, because if they don't get that support, then that's when they might be in that situation of escalating because they've had nothing to help with intervention. So that's, the whole focus is on child protection, prevention, safeguarding.
If anybody does want to find out more about Stop It Now, as I say, in our last forum week in December 25, we did have colleagues from Lucy Faithfull Foundation coming along specifically to talk about Stop It Now. So if you go to the SSCP website, we've got lots of information there and the recording of that webinar if you want to see that. Or better still, go to the Lucy Faithfull Foundation website. It's all there for you, and there's tons of information, resources, and support available. So Alex, thank you so much. Genuinely, thank you so much. I think that's been really, really fascinating to do a bit of a deep dive into this topic. And yeah, really get a much better understanding about actually what it is we're looking at and what we need to think about when we're thinking about safeguarding children. Is there anything else you wanted to add in? Any key takeaways? Any key messages?
I think the only key message I have is with this issue specifically, with women who sexually harm, let's make sure we keep talking about it and keep talking to each other and share good practice with each other, because we know sexual abuse thrives on not talking, and that's the same with this issue. So we need to, make sure that we are communicating, we are making it clear that we know that this is the thing, and we're working with that.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for your time today. I really genuinely appreciate it, and it would be great to talk to you again at some point if we can.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Alex. Take care. Bye-bye. As always, if you'd like to find out more details on the topics discussed in today's episode, please go to the SSCP website at somersetsafeguardingchildren.org.uk or the Lucy Faithfull Foundation website, which is just lucyfaithfull.org.uk, or by following any of the links in this episode description. Now, if you enjoy listening to the P-Pod, we would really appreciate it if you took that time to follow or subscribe to us on your chosen platform, or even better, leave us a review to let other people know about it, and make sure to let your colleagues know about this podcast and encourage them to come and join us here as well. It really does help to spread the word. Now, if you have any questions or comments arising from today's episode, or would like to be involved in future episodes, we would love you to get in touch with us at thepod@somerset.gov.uk. Once again, I'd like to give a huge thank you to my guest today, Dr. Alex Bailey, forensic psychologist from the Lucy Faithfull Foundation. And as always, I'd like to thank you for listening. My name is Steve Maccabee, and I'm the training manager for the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership. And I look forward to you joining us again next time at the P-Pod.
Let's work together to help keep children safe.